He wagon wheels ground to a halt in the dust of Millbrook's main street, their iron rims scraping against stone with a sound that seemed to echo her heart. Tired, worn, and nearly broken, Clara Whitmore stepped down from the driver's seat, her boots finding purchase on ground that felt foreign beneath her feet. The November wind cut through her wool traveling dress, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and something else, the particular emptiness that seemed to hang over frontier towns like a shroud. She had written to Thomas Brennan 3 times. His letters back had been warm, promising, full of talk about the life they would build together in this growing settlement. A respectable woman of good character, he had written, would find a welcome place here. The words had sustained her through the long journey from Kansas City, through the sale of her mother's few possessions, through the whispered conversations that followed her wherever she went. But Thomas Brennan was not waiting for her. Instead, a thin man with suspicious eyes and a sheriff's badge approached her wagon. "You'd be Miss Whitmore, I reckon." "Yes." She smoothed her skirts, trying to ignore the way her hands trembled. "I'm here to meet Mr. Brennan." He said he'd Thomas left town 3 days past. The sheriff's voice carried no warmth, no apology. "Married the widow Patterson and took her back to her folks in Colorado. Didn't leave no message." The words hit her like a physical blow. Around them, the street seemed to pause, women in their bonnets turning to stare, men emerging from the saloon to watch the show. Clara felt their eyes like pinpricks against her skin, felt the weight of their judgment settling on her shoulders like snow. "I see." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Then I suppose I'll need to find lodging for the night." The sheriff shifted his weight, his gaze sliding away from hers. "Well, now, that might be a problem. This is a decent town, Miss Whitmore. We don't much cotton to unattached women taking up residence." Heat flooded her cheeks, but she kept her spine straight. She had survived worse than this, had survived the scandal in Kansas City, the loss of her teaching position, the cold shoulders of people who had once called her friend. She would survive this too. "I have money," she said quietly. "I can pay for a room. Money ain't the issue." The sheriff's tone held finality. "You best be moving on come morning. The stagecoach runs through here twice a week." Clara nodded once, a sharp movement that concealed the tremor in her throat. She climbed back onto her wagon, gathered the reins in hands that had grown numb with cold, and guided her tired horses toward the edge of town. Behind her, she could hear the murmur of voices, the rustle of satisfaction that came when a community had successfully expelled what it deemed unwelcome. The sun was setting by the time she found the abandoned cabin, its roof partially caved in, but its walls still standing. It would have to do. As she unhitched her horses in the dying light, Clara Whitmore made herself a promise. She would not be moved along like a piece of unwanted baggage. Not this time. She had come too far to turn back now. The cabin's silence pressed against Clara like a weight. She had spent her first night huddled in her wagon, wrapped in her mother's quilt, listening to the wind howl through the gaps in the roof above. Now, in the gray light of dawn, she surveyed what would have to become her sanctuary. The previous owners had left behind the bones of a life, a rough-hewn table, its surface scarred by knives and weather, a stone fireplace blackened with use, shelves that sagged under the weight of accumulated dust. In the corner, a narrow bed frame stood empty, its rope springs stretched loose with time. The floorboards creaked under her weight as she walked, some warped from rain that had leaked through the damaged roof, but the walls were solid. The door hung true on its hinges, and most importantly, it was hers by right of abandonment and desperation. Clara rolled up her sleeves and began the work of making it livable. She swept out the debris, dead leaves, broken glass, the small bones of creatures that had sought shelter and found only death. She stuffed rags into the worst of the gaps between logs, hung her oilcloth over the damaged portion of roof. When she lit her first fire in the hearth, the smoke rose clean and straight, and for the first time in days, she felt something approaching. Warmth. The work consumed her daylight hours, but when evening came, the loneliness settled in like fog. She sat at the scarred table, eating cold beans from a tin, and tried not to think about the life she had imagined. Thomas Brennan's steady presence, a proper house with glass windows, perhaps children's laughter echoing from the rooms. Instead, she had silence broken only by the settling of logs and the distant howl of coyotes. She opened her trunk and pulled out her sewing basket, running her fingers over the spools of thread, the packets of needles, the squares of fabric she had saved from her mother's dresses. These were her tools, her trade, her hope for survival. Tomorrow she would venture back into town, not as a rejected bride seeking charity, but as a woman offering services. The thought should have comforted her. Instead, it sat in her chest like a stone. She had seen the looks, heard the whispers. In their eyes, she was already ruined, a woman who traveled alone, who had been cast off by her intended, who now lived like a hermit on the edge of respectability. But she had her needle and thread. She had her mother's recipes written in careful script on yellowed paper. She had her own 2 hands and the stubborn will that had carried her this far. It would have to be enough. Outside, the November wind picked up, rattling the shutters she had managed to rehang. Clara banked the fire, spread her quilt on the rope bed, and lay down to sleep in her new home. In the darkness, she whispered a prayer, not for rescue, but for the strength to build whatever came next. Clara's boots made soft sounds against the boardwalk as she walked down Millbrook's main street, a basket of her work tucked under her arm. 3 weeks had passed since her arrival, 3 weeks of mending her own clothes, practicing her stitches by lamplight, and gathering the courage for this moment. The general store stood solid and square, its windows displaying bolts of fabric and household goods. A small bell chimed as she pushed through the door, and conversations quieted as heads turned toward her. She recognized some of the faces: the banker's wife with her pinched mouth, the minister's daughter with her curious eyes, the sheriff's sister who had been present during her humiliation. "May I help you?" The voice came from behind the counter, steady and without judgment. Clara looked up to find a man of perhaps 35, with work-roughened hands and kind eyes the color of autumn leaves. His dark hair was neatly combed, his shirt clean but patched at the elbow. "I'm looking for work," she said, keeping her voice level. "Sewing, mending, alterations. I have examples of my stitching if you'd like to see." She set her basket on the counter and pulled out a child's dress she had made from scraps: tiny stitches, careful seams, a collar edged with delicate embroidery. Murmurs rippled through the store as the women gathered closer, their eyes sharp with assessment. "That's fine work," the man said, running his thumb along the seam. "I'm Jacob Morrison. I run this place." He gestured to the shelves around them. "We do get requests for seamstress work. Mrs. Patterson used to handle it, but she's moved on." Clara's cheeks warmed at the mention of the woman who had taken her intended husband, but she kept her expression neutral. "I can handle any type of sewing: dresses, shirts, household linens. I also bake, if there's call for that." "Baking?" Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, stepped forward with skeptical interest. "What sort of baking? Bread, pies, cakes?" "I have my mother's recipes." Clara pulled a small loaf from her basket, wrapped in clean cloth. "Apple bread with cinnamon. You're welcome to try it." The women exchanged glances, and Clara could read the conflict in their faces. They wanted to dismiss her, to maintain their united front of disapproval. But the bread smelled of home and comfort, and winter was coming on fast. Jacob Morrison cut a small slice and tasted it thoughtfully. "This is good, very good." He looked at Clara with something that might have been respect. "I think we might be able to work something out." "She's living in that old cabin," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice carrying a note of warning. "All alone. It's not proper. A woman's got to live somewhere," Jacob replied mildly. "And she's offering honest work for honest pay. Can't see the harm in that." Clara felt a flutter of hope in her chest, fragile as a bird's wing. "I can start immediately. I have time and I need the work." "Fair enough." Jacob pulled out a ledger and made a note. "I'll spread the word. You can check back with me in a day or two. See what comes of it." As Clara gathered her basket and prepared to leave, she caught sight of her reflection in the store window, a woman standing straighter than she had in weeks, her chin lifted with purpose. Behind her, the conversations resumed, but she no longer cared what they said. She had made her first foothold in this hard place. The rest would come, one careful stitch at a time. The work came slowly at first: a torn sleeve here, a loose button there. Clara took each task seriously, her stitches small and even, her repairs nearly invisible. Within a week, Jacob Morrison had more requests than he could manage, and Clara found herself spending several hours each day in the back room of the general store, her sewing box open beside her, her needle flashing in the lamplight. Jacob had given her a corner near the window where the light was good, and she had made it her own with a wooden spool for her thread and a small cushion for her pins. Sometimes she caught him watching her work, not with the calculating gaze of a man appraising a woman, but with the quiet attention of someone who appreciated craftsmanship. You make it look easy, he said one afternoon, setting a cup of coffee beside her elbow without being asked. The gesture was small, but it spoke of consideration, of someone who noticed when another person might be thirsty. It is easy, once you know the way of it. Clara accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her fingers around the warm ceramic. My mother always said that mending was more than fixing what's broken, it's about making something stronger than. It was before. Jacob nodded, settling onto a crate beside her workstation. My father used to say something similar about wood, said you could always tell good work by how it lasted. They fell into comfortable silence, Clara's needle moving in steady rhythm while Jacob sorted through a shipment of dry goods. It was the first time in months that she had felt at ease in another person's company, the first time she hadn't braced herself for judgment or unwelcome attention. You don't talk much about where you came from, Jacob observed, not looking up from his ledger. Clara's hands stilled for a moment. Most folks here seem to have their minds made up about that already. I'm not most folks. Something in his tone made her look up. His eyes were serious, kind, without the prurient curiosity she had grown accustomed to. Kansas City, she said finally. I was a teacher there. Was? The simple question carried no judgment, only invitation. Clara found herself speaking words she hadn't planned to say. There was a misunderstanding about my conduct with a student's father. Nothing improper happened, but the appearance was enough. She kept her voice steady, matter of fact. I lost my position, my reputation. Thomas Brennan had written to me about opportunities out here, and I thought, you thought you'd find a fresh start. I thought I'd find a husband and a chance to disappear from my own life. The honesty surprised her. Instead, I found something different. Jacob was quiet for a long moment, his hands still on his ledger. Sometimes what we find is better than what we were looking for. Clara met his gaze and saw something there that made her breath catch, not pity, not desire, but recognition. As if he saw her not as a fallen woman or a cautionary tale, but as someone who had been tested and proven strong. The coffee's good, she said, needing to break the moment before it could grow too large. Jacob smiled, the first real smile she had seen from him. It's terrible, but it's hot. Clara laughed, a sound that seemed to surprise them both. Outside, the November wind was picking up, rattling the windows and promising snow. But inside the store, with her needle in her hand and Jacob's quiet presence beside her, she felt something she hadn't experienced in a very long time. She felt seen. December arrived with a vengeance, blanketing Millbrook in snow that transformed the rough frontier town into something almost beautiful. Clara's breath fogged in the cold air as she made her daily walk to the general store, her boots crunching through the drifts, her sewing basket protected under her heavy wool cloak. The store had become her anchor, the back room her sanctuary. Jacob had installed a small stove near her workstation, claiming the extra heat was good for the merchandise, but Clara knew better. She had caught him watching her shiver one morning, had seen the way his jaw tightened when she tried to work with stiff fingers. You don't need to come in today, he said one morning when the snow was falling thick as cotton. The roads are near impassable. I have Mrs. Chen's wedding dress to finish, Clara replied, shaking the snow from her cloak. She's counting on me. Jacob studied her face, taking in the pink in her cheeks from the cold, the determination in her eyes. You could have sent word. I would have understood. I gave my word I'd finish it. Clara settled at her workstation, flexing her fingers to warm them. Besides, I like the work. What she couldn't say was that she had come to look forward to these quiet hours, to the sound of Jacob moving through the store, to the small conversations that had become the brightest part of her days. She had begun to notice things about him, the way he always had a kind word for the children who came in with their mothers, how he extended credit to families struggling through the winter, the careful way he treated her work as if it were something precious. Clara, he said one afternoon, and the sound of her name in his voice made her look up from her embroidery. I've been thinking. About what? About Christmas. The town always has a celebration, nothing fancy, just folks gathering. At the church hall, there's usually music, some dancing. He paused, as if choosing his words carefully. I was wondering if you might like to go with me. Clara's needle stilled. In all the weeks she'd been working at the store, no one had invited her to anything. The townspeople had grown accustomed to her presence, had even begun to nod when they passed her on the street, but she was still an outsider, still the woman who lived alone in the broken cabin. I don't know if that's wise, she said quietly. People will talk. People already talk. Jacob's voice was gentle but firm. Question is, do you want to let them decide how you live your life? Clara looked at him, really looked, and saw something in his expression that made her heart race. Not pity, not charity, but something deeper. Something that spoke of a man who had been watching her for weeks, who had seen her dignity in the face of rejection, her grace under pressure, her quiet strength. I don't have anything appropriate to wear, she said, and immediately regretted the words. They sounded like an excuse, a way to retreat from the risk he was offering. You could make something, Jacob suggested. I've got some fabric in the back, a bolt of blue wool that came in last week. Consider it payment for all the extra work you've been doing. Clara felt something flutter in her chest, warm and fragile. You don't need to, I want to. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. I want to see you there, with me, outside. The snow continued to fall, muffling the sounds of the town. Inside the store, Clara felt the careful walls she had built around her heart beginning to crack. She had been so focused on survival, on proving her worth through work and perseverance, that she had forgotten what it felt like to be wanted simply for who she was. All right, she said softly. I'll go. Jacob's smile was like sunrise after a long cold night. Good, that's good. Clara returned to her embroidery, but her hands were trembling now, and not from the cold. She had just said yes to something that felt like the beginning of everything she had stopped allowing herself to hope for. The blue wool was beautiful, soft as a whisper and the color of twilight sky. Clara ran her fingers over the fabric, feeling its weight and promise. She had been working on her Christmas dress for 3 days now, stealing moments between her other commissions to cut and stitch and dream. But tonight, by the light of her oil lamp, she worked on something else entirely. The shirt was taking shape under her careful hands, each stitch placed with deliberate precision. She had studied Jacob's measurements by watching him work, noting the breadth of his shoulders, the length of his arms, the way his current shirts pulled slightly across his chest. This one would fit him perfectly, she was certain of it. The fabric was cream-colored cotton, soft but sturdy, with pearl buttons she had saved from her mother's good dress. She had embroidered his initials on the inside of the collar in thread so fine it was almost invisible, a secret mark that only he would know was there. It was a gift that spoke of things she couldn't yet say aloud, of evenings spent watching him work with quiet efficiency, of mornings when his smile was the first thing she looked forward to seeing, of the way he had made space for her in his world without asking for anything in return. Christmas Eve arrived with a clarity that made the snow sparkle like diamonds. Clara walked to the store with her gift wrapped in brown paper, her heart beating so fast she could hear it in her ears. She had dressed carefully in her new blue dress, her hair pinned up with her mother's silver combs, her best wool cloak around her shoulders. Jacob was waiting for her, and when he saw her, his face went still with wonder. Clara, he said, her name barely a whisper. You look different, she asked, smoothing her skirts nervously. Beautiful, he finished. You look beautiful. The word hung between them like a bridge neither had dared to cross before. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she didn't look away from his gaze. I have something for you, she said, extending the wrapped package. It's not much, but I wanted. I thought you might. Jacob took the package with careful hands, as if it were made of spun glass. When he unwrapped it and held up the shirt, Clara saw something shift in his expression: surprise, pleasure, and something deeper that made her breath catch. You made this. It wasn't a question. I noticed your others were getting worn, Clara said, her voice soft. I thought you might need. No one's ever made me anything before. Jacob's voice was rough with emotion. Not since my mother died. He held the shirt against his chest, and Clara could see that her measurements had been true. It would fit him perfectly. She watched him discover the tiny embroidered initials, saw the way his thumb traced over them with reverent care. Thank you, he said, looking up at her with eyes that held everything he couldn't yet say. This means more than you know. Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. She had given him more than a shirt. She had given him a piece of her heart, wrapped in careful stitches and quiet hope. We should go, she said finally. The celebration will be starting soon. Jacob folded the shirt carefully and set it aside. I have something for you too, he said, reaching behind the counter. It's not much, but he held out a small wooden box, its surface smooth and warm from handling. Inside, nestled in soft cloth, was a silver thimble etched with delicate flowers. For "You're sewing," he said. "I had it made by the blacksmith. I hoped you might like it." Clara lifted the thimble with trembling fingers. It was beautiful, practical, precious, a gift that spoke of someone who had been watching her work, who understood what mattered to her. "It's perfect," she whispered. "Thank you." As she slipped the thimble onto her finger, Clara felt something settle into place between them, an understanding, a promise, a beginning. The church hall glowed with lamplight and the warmth of gathered bodies. Clara paused at the threshold, Jacob's hand steady at her elbow, and felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with facing the judgment of others. But tonight felt different. Tonight, she was not alone. "Ready?" Jacob asked quietly, and when she nodded, he guided her into the room. The conversations didn't stop exactly, but they shifted, became more careful, more watchful. Clara felt the weight of dozens of eyes taking in her appearance, the careful elegance of her blue dress, the way Jacob's hand rested protectively at her back, the fact that she was here at all. Mrs. Henderson was the first to approach, her smile, tight but polite. "Miss Whitmore, how lovely to see you here." "Mrs. Henderson." Clara inclined her head graciously. "What a beautiful evening you've all created." "Yes, well." The banker's wife's gaze flicked between Clara and Jacob, clearly calculating. "I hear you've been quite busy with your sewing." Mrs. Chen was very pleased with her wedding dress. "I'm glad she was satisfied with the work." Before Mrs. Henderson could probe further, the minister called for attention, and the gathered crowd turned toward the small stage where a fiddle player was tuning his instrument. Clara felt Jacob's hand brush hers, a brief touch that steadied her nerves. The music began, a waltz, sweet and simple. Couples moved onto the makeshift dance floor, and Clara watched them with something between longing and resignation. She had not danced since her disgrace in Kansas City, had not felt the pleasure of moving to music in another person's arms. "Would you dance with me?" Jacob's voice was low, meant only for her ears. Clara's heart stuttered. Don't think about them," he said, extending his hand. "Dance with me because you want to." And she did want to. Despite everything, the whispers, the stares, the careful distance she had maintained for so long, she wanted to feel his arms around her, wanted to move with him to the music's rhythm. She placed her hand in his, and he led her onto the floor. Jacob was a good dancer, sure and steady, his hand warm at her waist. Clara felt herself relax into his lead, her body remembering rhythms she had thought lost forever. They moved together as if they had been dancing for years, as if the hours spent in quiet companionship at the store had taught them each other's rhythms. "You're smiling," Jacob observed, his voice soft with wonder. Claire realized he was right. She was smiling, really smiling for the first time in months. "I had forgotten how this felt." "What?" "Being happy." Something flickered across Jacob's face, tender and fierce at once. "Then we'll have to dance more often." Around them, Clara became aware of the other dancers, of the conversations at the edges of the room. She saw Mrs. Chen watching them with approval, saw the minister's wife nodding as if something had been settled in her mind. Even Mrs. Henderson's expression had softened slightly, as if Clara's presence here, on Jacob's arm, had shifted some fundamental calculation. But it was the children who mattered most. Little Mary Sullivan, whose torn pinafore Clara had mended just last week, broke away from her mother to tug at Clara's skirt. "Miss Clara, you look so pretty. Will you dance with me next?" Clara's heart melted. She glanced at Jacob, who nodded with understanding, and when the waltz ended, she found herself spinning the little girl around the floor. Mary's laughter bright as silver bells, other children joined them, and soon Clara was surrounded by small hands and bright faces, by requests for stories and promises to visit their mother's sewing circles. The adults watched this transformation with something like surprise, as if they were seeing her clearly for the first time. When Jacob reclaimed her for another dance, Clara felt different, lighter, more rooted, more herself than she had been in years. "Look at you," he said, his eyes warm with pride. "You're not hiding anymore." Clara looked around the room and realized he was right. She had stopped bracing for rejection, stopped expecting the worst. Instead, she had found her place in this small community, not as a fallen woman seeking redemption, but as someone who belonged. "No," she agreed, meeting his gaze. "I'm not hiding anymore." The celebration had wound down to quiet conversations and sleepy children. Clara and Jacob walked slowly through the snow-covered streets, their footsteps muffled by the white blanket that transformed Millbrook into something magical. The cold air carried the scent of wood smoke and winter, and above them, stars scattered across the sky like diamonds spilled on dark velvet. "Thank you," Clara said as they reached the edge of town where the path to her cabin began. "For tonight, for everything." Jacob stopped walking, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Clara, I need to tell you something." Something in his voice made her turn to face him fully. In the moonlight, his face was serious, almost grave, and she felt her heart begin to race. "I know what people said about you when you first came here," he began, his words careful and deliberate. "I know what they still whisper sometimes. And I want you to know I don't care. Not about any of it." Clara's throat tightened. "Jacob, let me finish." His voice was gentle but firm. "I've been watching you these past months. I've seen how you work, how you treat people, how you carry yourself even when the world seems set against you. I've seen your kindness with the children, your patience with difficult customers, your determination to build something good from nothing." He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the warmth in his eyes, the way they never wavered from her face. "I don't know what happened in Kansas City, and I don't need to. What I know is who you are now, who you've always been underneath all the hurt and judgment. You're strong, Clara. You're good. And you're the finest woman I've ever known." Clara felt tears prick her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of recognition, of being seen and valued for who she truly was. "I'm not the woman you think I am," she whispered. "I'm not perfect, Jacob. I've made mistakes. I've been foolish and proud and human," he finished softly. "You've been human, just like the rest of us." The words broke something open in Clara's chest, something that had been locked away for so long she had forgotten it existed. She thought of the scandal in Kansas City, the widowed father who had pursued her with unwelcome attention, the way she had tried to handle it quietly, professionally, until his persistence had created rumors that destroyed her reputation. She thought of the loneliness, the shame, the way she had learned to expect rejection. "I was a teacher," she said, her voice barely audible. "There was a man, a parent, who wouldn't accept my refusal of his advances. He told people I had encouraged him, that I was improper. The school board dismissed me without even asking for my side of the story." Jacob's jaw tightened, but his eyes remained gentle. "I'm sorry that happened to you. I'm sorry people failed you when you needed them most. I came here thinking I could disappear into a marriage, become someone else entirely. But you..." She looked up at him, seeing the truth written in his expression. "You never asked me to be anyone but myself, because yourself is extraordinary," he said simply. When they broke apart, Jacob rested his forehead against hers. "Will you marry me, Clara?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, I will." Above them, the stars continued their ancient dance, witnesses to a love that had grown slowly, carefully, rooted in respect and watered with kindness until it bloomed into something that could weather any storm. Spring arrived early that year, melting the snow in rushing streams and coaxing green shoots from the thawing earth. Clara stood in the doorway of what would soon be their home, the cabin that Jacob had been quietly renovating through the winter months, adding a proper roof, real windows, and a kitchen worthy of her baking. "The garden plot is ready," Jacob called from the yard, where he was turning over rich, dark soil. "Just waiting for you to tell me what to plant." Clara smiled, running her hand over the smooth wooden frame he had built around the door. Everything he touched seemed to become more solid, more lasting. In the months since their engagement, she had watched him transform not just the cabin, but her entire world. The town had accepted their union with something approaching enthusiasm. Mrs. Henderson had commissioned a wedding dress from Clara herself, and the minister's wife had organized a quilting circle that met twice weekly in the church basement. Clara found herself at the center of it all, no longer the outsider looking in, but a woman preparing to become a wife, a neighbor, a permanent member of the community. "I was thinking vegetables in the back," Clara said, stepping into the yard to join him. "Beans and squash and corn, but flowers in front, roses, maybe, and hollyhocks for height." Jacob leaned on his shovel, his face bright with sweat and satisfaction. "Roses sound perfect. My mother always said a house wasn't a home without flowers by the door." Clara felt a familiar warmth at these mentions of his mother, these glimpses into the man he had been before she knew him. They had spent long evenings by the fire, sharing stories of their past lives, their dreams, their fears. She knew now that he had been alone for nearly 5 years, that he had given up hope of finding someone who would see past his quiet nature to the depth of feeling beneath. I ordered the rose bushes from the catalog, she said, settling beside him on the wooden crate he had positioned for her comfort. They should arrive next week, along with the new stove, Jacob added, grinning. You're going to have quite the kitchen, Mrs. Morrison. The name still sent a thrill through her. Mrs. Morrison, Clara Morrison, a woman with a future, a home, a place in the world that no one could take away. I've been thinking about the store, she said, watching him work. After we're married, I'd like to keep the sewing corner, if you don't mind. I enjoy the work, and the ladies seem to appreciate having someone local. Jacob paused in his digging, looking up at her with that expression she had come to treasure, the look that said he was seeing her exactly as she was and finding her perfect. Of course you'll keep working, he said. It's part of who you are. Besides, I like having you there. Makes the whole place feel more like home. Clara felt her heart swell with gratitude and love. He had never asked her to be less than she was, never suggested that marriage should diminish her in any way. Instead, he had found ways to make her gifts flourish, to give her the security and support she needed to become fully herself. June 15th, she said softly. 3 more weeks. 3 more weeks, Jacob agreed, his voice warm with anticipation. Are you ready? Clara looked around at their cabin with its fresh whitewash and new shutters, at the garden plot waiting for seeds, at the man who had seen her worth when she had forgotten it herself. She thought of the woman who had arrived in Millbrook 6 months ago, broken and desperate and convinced she was beyond redemption. That woman felt like a stranger now. I'm ready, she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. Jacob set aside his shovel and pulled her into his arms, spinning her around until she laughed with pure joy. When he set her down, he kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. I love you, Clara Morrison, he said against her mouth. I love you too, she replied, tasting the words like honey. More than I ever thought possible. As they stood together in the yard of their future home, Clara felt the last of her old wounds heal over. She had found more than a husband in Jacob Morrison. She had found herself, strong and whole and ready for whatever came next. The morning of June 15th dawned clear and golden, with a warmth that promised the full glory of summer to come. Clara stood before the mirror in their cabin, adjusting the simple white dress she had sewn for her wedding day. The fabric was fine cotton, soft and practical, with pearl buttons that had once graced her mother's Sunday dress. She had embroidered tiny flowers along the neckline, work so delicate it seemed to have grown there naturally. You look beautiful, said Mary Chen, who had insisted on helping Clara prepare. The young woman had become a dear friend over the winter months, one of the first to welcome Clara fully into the community. Jacob is going to forget how to breathe when he sees you. Clara smiled, touching the silver locket at her throat, Jacob's wedding gift to her, containing a pressed flower from the roses they had planted together. I can hardly believe this day is here. Believe it, Mary said firmly. You've earned every bit of happiness coming to you. The church was full when Clara arrived, the pews packed with faces that had become familiar, friendly, dear. She saw Mrs. Henderson dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, saw the minister's wife beaming with satisfaction, saw the children from the Christmas celebration waving eagerly from the front row. But it was Jacob she looked for, Jacob she found waiting at the altar in his best suit and the cream-colored shirt she had made him for Christmas. His face when he saw her was everything she had dreamed, wonder, love, and a joy so profound it seemed to light him from within. The ceremony was simple, heartfelt, perfect. They spoke their vows in clear voices, promising to love and cherish and stand by each other through whatever storms might come. When Jacob slipped the gold band onto her finger, Clara felt something settle into place, not just the ring, but a sense of belonging so complete it took her breath away. You may kiss your bride, the minister announced, and Jacob's kiss was gentle and reverent, full of promise for all the years ahead. The celebration afterward was held in the churchyard, with tables laden with food. The whole community had contributed. Clara moved through the crowd like a woman in a dream, accepting congratulations and well wishes, dancing with her new husband as the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold. As the evening wound down, Clara found herself sitting on the porch steps of the church, watching the last of the children play in the fading light. Jacob settled beside her, his arm around her shoulders, and they sat in comfortable silence. Happy? He asked softly, beyond words," Claire replied, leaning into his warmth. "I keep thinking about the woman who got off that wagon 6 months ago. She was so lost, so convinced she was beyond saving. She was never beyond saving," Jacob said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "She just needed someone to remind her who she already was." Clara turned to look at him, this man who had seen her true worth when she had forgotten it herself. "You didn't remind me," she said quietly. "You showed me, every day, with every kindness, every moment of respect. You showed me that I was worth loving." "We showed each other," Jacob corrected gently. "You taught me that love doesn't always announce itself with trumpets and fanfare. Sometimes it comes quietly, in the small moments, in the choice to see someone clearly and love them anyway." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Clara felt the profound peace that comes from finding your place in the world. She had survived scandal and rejection, loneliness and despair. She had rebuilt herself from nothing, thread by careful thread, and discovered that she was stronger than she had ever imagined. "Come on, Mrs. Morrison," Jacob said, standing and offering her his hand. "Let's go home." Clara took his hand and let him help her to her feet. Together, they walked toward their cabin, toward the life they would build together, toward a future bright with possibility. Behind them, the church bell chimed the hour, a gentle sound that seemed to bless their beginning. And in the garden they had planted together, the roses bloomed in the darkness, filling the night air with the sweet promise of love that would last through all seasons to come.